This is Christian Kirk. I'm with Air Resource Specialists in Fort Collins, Colorado. I'm the QA officer and lead auditor here at ARS. I've been here 14 years doing all manner of ambient air quality monitoring activities, from data validation to documentation to calibration and maintenance and audit work. Thanks, Mike. Good morning, everyone. So now we're going to talk about, as Mike said, is how you connect up to your data loggers in order to get your data remotely without having to go to the air monitoring site. And from there, data can get posted to various locations like AirNow or Crest and things of that nature. Next slide. So this is a very generic network layout, similar in a fashion to what Mike had shown before. On the bottom right, you've got your analyzer or sensor that's making the measurement, that's sending that signal, whether it be analog or digital, to your data logger. And your data logger is aggregating that data into minute or hourly averages or whatever you need that data to be collected in. And then that data logger can be connected to a device server, depending on the way the connection is set up, and we'll talk about that more very soon, as well as the router and what that means and what that does. And then finally, your modem is your connection to the outside world, the internet, for that transmission of that data. Next slide. So a modem is simply a device that modulates and demodulates the signals. So they're digital signals that it's transforming to analog signals for transmissions that then get converted back to a digital signal. So, I'm pretty sure people are remembering the old days of dial-up modems. It's the same thing nowadays, except we have digital modems that usually run on cellular service, or you've got DSL modems that are running on that type of service from a service provider. The modem is important because that's what bridges the WAN and the LAN. The WAN is your wide area network. That's the internet or the outside world. The LAN is the local area network. That is your monitoring station with all your devices hooked together on a network. So, and they can be either directly connected to the Ethernet because they've got an Ethernet port and things of that nature, or you can connect them by use of other devices to get them on their network if they're only an analog or serial device. Next slide. So the router's function is to basically direct communications from the outside world onto your LAN using this TCP/IP protocol, which is our standard internet communications protocol that we use. Most IP addresses that we're going to be using, if you're familiar with IP addresses, are 4 octets, meaning that you have 4 numbers that vary from 1 to 255. It's also important to know that most modems can also act as routers. So even though we're treating them right now in our discussion as 2 separate devices, they could actually be the same device. And so the router is the critical component of getting your site connected to the outside world. An important note about modems is that you want your internet service provider to provide you with a static IP address for your modem. Most times when you sign up for any type of internet service, you'll be provided a connection with a modem, but the IP address to your site can vary depending upon usage. That way your ISP can connect more devices to the same network if everyone's sharing IP addresses. When someone's not in use, someone else can use it, and they have a protocol set up to make sure traffic is directed appropriately. But for your purposes, when you dial into your site, you want to know what the number is, the IP address is, every time you connect. So usually it costs a little bit more money to get a static IP address, but that's what's going to be required to make all this work. Next slide. device server, I use that term generically. It's just going to be any device that transforms Ethernet communications to serial communications. This allows devices like Met1 BAMs, for example, to be connected to your local area network. Most of the old BAMs only have serial ports. And then you also have your data logger, which Mike has talked about in great detail. That's the device we're trying to connect to. Your connection to that device could either be serial or digital, and that will determine how we need to go about connecting to that device in order to collect our data remotely. And lastly, it's just the analyzer or sensor. You know, it's your device making your measurements of interest that are connected to the logger. So next slide. So we're going to talk about connecting our data loggers now to the modem slash router, because like I said, they could be either separate or the same device, the modem router, that is. Next slide. So the key to routers is this idea of port forwarding. Almost all routers that I've come across have a user programmable table that tells the router where all the internet traffic should go. So these ports are basically software ports, but you can think of them in the same fashion as, you know, physical ports on like your logger, for example. Like if you have 2 serial ports on the logger, those are 2 different ports. These are the like software equivalents. So if you look at this table has what's labeled as a public start port, public end port. Every router will display this information a little bit differently, but all the information is there. The ports on the left side are the ports that are coming in from the remote connection from the outside world. So if I'm at my office here dialing into a site, say in Wyoming, and I'm connecting to this particular site on port 6783, the router is going to say, he wants 6783. That's going to go to this 192.168.1.5 IP address on my LAN locally and connected also to port 6783. Now, it's important to notice that the ports on the left side and the right side don't have to match, and you can actually send multiple ports to the same IP address. So I've highlighted these 2 squares in red because I'm going to talk about them in a little bit more detail. If you notice a little bit lower, the last 3 entries are different ports coming in from the outside world going to different IP addresses, but those IP addresses are all utilizing the same port. So it's important to know that multiple ports can be used on the right side if they're going to different IP addresses. And I can certainly answer questions about this in more detail later. Next slide. So simply put, the ports are just communication endpoints that provide basically communications for multiple services or multiple communication sessions to one network address. I mean, you can think of it as ports as, you know, you have multiple ports going to the same address. That's like having multiple phone numbers going to the same home. And certainly you can, you know, specify port numbers to be designated for particular purposes. As you noticed before, you saw port 80 was listed. That is the default HTTP port. So if you have a device that's hosting like a website internally, you know, that's a port that you use to connect to that. There's also 2 common ways, 2 common protocols for connecting through devices, and that's the TCP and the UDP. So if you don't know which protocol to use, you can actually enable most routers to use both protocols. But the bottom line is this port forwarding is key to getting access to your site and your data remotely. The use of the router and programming port forwarding correctly is essential. Next slide. I like to think of routers as like a hotel. So I have this hotel analogy that I set up. You know, you can think of the router as the front desk. So if you're calling from the outside world, you're going to be, you know, using some 1-800 number of the hotel or some other number of the hotel. But if you're at the hotel and you want to call the front desk, usually you dial 9 or 0. That's the difference between the router's WAN IP address and the router's LAN IP address. So taking this example, you know, you're going to call the Bellagio in Las Vegas. That's equivalent to connecting to some WAN IP address from your office. When you get the front desk, you're going to ask for Mike King. Basically, that's like requesting a certain port number. The front desk is going to look up Mike and find his room number. That's the router using the port forwarding table. It's going to look up 6783 and find where the LAN IP address is associated with that port number. The front desk then connects you to Mike in the presidential suite. That's like the router connecting you to a certain LAN IP on that port 6783. And that's from my example previously. These numbers obviously will vary however you set up. There's nothing special about that. Once you've connected, now you're talking to Mike. The equivalent is you're connecting to your data logger or instrument of interest and grabbing the data, or even doing troubleshooting, looking at diagnostics. It's the applications can be almost limitless, not just database, but also keeping your site up and running with remote troubleshooting. Next slide. So thinking back to the table I showed you, that table is actually from a router that I've set up in the field. And so in the example I provided, I said port 6783 connects to this 192.168.1.5 at 6783. That connection is actually a Campbell Scientific data logger using my LoggerNet remotely from my office. The next example, where I use 3 different ports that are all connected to the same IP address on 3 different ports, that's actually using the NumaView software for the new Teledyne systems. So I can connect to Teledyne instruments remotely from my office. I can do Thermo instruments remotely from my office. That allows us to not only diagnose instruments, but you can also then collect data directly from the instruments as well, because most of them have internal data loggers. Yeah, it's very powerful. Next question. Sorry, next slide. Just a brief, I want to talk briefly, very briefly about security. Next slide. So almost all devices have passwords, which are going to be default. You want to make sure that you password protect all your devices on your network, not only from someone maybe accessing it from the outside through the WAN, but also if someone is able to hook a computer up to your LAN and then surf to these devices and try to access them. Because otherwise they can change settings and then things won't work correctly. So just good security measures, always password protect your devices, and don't use default passwords, use something unique. Next slide. Just something else I wanted to mention with all this, you know, setting your site up for remote connection is you can actually use your cell phone to connect to your site to look at data, troubleshoot, etc. A lot of vendors have apps that you can use. In the case of LoggerLink is provided by Campbell Scientific. It's a free app. Once you set up your connection information, you can log in from your phone and look at data. There's also third-party apps like that provide like hyperterminal type telnet applications access. That's useful for connecting to ESC loggers, especially the 8816, 8832 series or Met1 bands. That allows you not only look at data, but also allow you to, for example, on a Met1 band, you can log in remotely and look at error codes on it, and troubleshoot. And Agile also has apps. Thermo Scientific has apps. So next slide. I'm just going to show some brief examples of network setups. There's almost limitless combinations, so I can't go through them all, but I just thought I'd give you some common examples. Here's a Cradlepoint cellular modem with a CR1000 data logger. The Cradlepoint is a modem that also has routing capability, and so you can actually connect this modem to this logger two different ways, either by RS-232 or by TCP/IP internet. Next slide. So here are the two examples. I've got an Ethernet cable on the right example, an Ethernet cable running from the Cradlepoint to my CR1000 that has the NL120 Ethernet port. And on the left side, I've got a serial cable that's connected to the serial port on the Cradlepoint to the serial port on the CR1000. It's important to note it looks like there's two serial ports on the CR1000, but the bottom port is actually a CSIO port, which is for Campbell Scientific peripherals. It doesn't act like a RS-232 port for this purpose with this particular cable. Next slide. Here's an example of using a Zyxel DSL modem with an older 8816. Now, unlike the Campbell loggers, the 8816 does not have an Ethernet port. So in order to connect this modem with this logger, you'll have to use a serial device server, because if you'll notice, there's no serial port on this modem, and there's no Ethernet port on the logger. So next slide. So you can see that the modem connects to the serial device server using Ethernet, and that serial device server converts that Ethernet connection to a serial connection, which is then connected to the 8816 logger. I guess that's the end of my section for now. I'll pass it back over to Mike.